Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, Alternative Parties friends, we have another exciting guest. His name is Dan Sullivan. So, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Dan, let us get started by you kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Well, I'm the Vice President right now of the Council of Georgists organizations. Henry George ran on a third-party ticket for mayor of New York and quite possibly won and was running it during the Tammany Hall regime, so voter fraud was common back then. Ballots were seen floating down the East River, not for the first time. They had done that in 1851. The media picked up that they had seen ballot boxes floating down the river. And my background, I was actually as a preteen, I was in the Brentwood Teenage Republicans, which was actually started by libertarian factions within the Republican Party, the Young Americans for Freedom, which was William F. Buckley's group. Got into college, got involved in the anti-war movement, got involved in a lot of left liberal things. Was on the board of Americans for Democratic Action, which was the I guess basically the Eleanor Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party.
Okay.
And gradually went on from there, got involved in the Greens and then in the Libertarian Party. I was county chair of the Greens for a while. That was before they were a separate party. And then I was county chair of the Libertarian Party for a while.
Interesting.
So I don't have any particular party loyalty. My loyalty is to issues, but we're forced to work through the mechanisms of political parties. So you go where you've got to go.
Sure. So kindly tell us more about Henry George. Who was he? And you mentioned he ran under an alternative party ticket. What party was that called?
It was called the United Labor Party.
Okay.
And it was largely affiliated with the Knights of Labor, although the Knights of Labor didn't formally endorse it because they were nonpartisan for their own reasons. I don't think it was a legal requirement at the time, but they just considered it more to their benefit to not get involved in partisan politics or election campaigns.
Sure.
And then he wrote a book called Progress in Poverty, which launched the progressive movement. If you look at Google has an Ngram viewer, and Progress in Poverty came out in 1879, and the use of the word progressive began to rise in 1880 and continued to rise until Woodrow Wilson, and then it just leveled off because Wilson kind of betrayed a lot of what it stood for. I think I don't regard Wilson as evil so much as I regard him as inept. He was basically a college professor and college president, and I think they're easy to con. And I think that they tend to listen to elites and believe things they shouldn't believe. So the progressives wanted the greenback dollar. They wanted to divorce banking from money creation so that banks could only lend money that they actually had. And Wilson gave us the Federal Reserve with the argument that it could behave just like the greenback dollar, and while it while that's true that it could, it doesn't because bankers have always been in charge of it, and they made it work to their advantage. He also gave us the income tax and said that it was the initial rates for the income tax were so high that only 3% of the people paid any income tax. And he said it was only going to collect income from land rent. The progressives wanted a land value tax. And the key difference is that a land value tax would fall on all land that has value, including land that was held vacant. And the income tax only falls on land that's in use and producing income. So what it did is encourage people to hold land out of use. But that caused a division within the progressives because the income tax was actually had more support among socialists who opposed progressives. Socialists and progressives were very much at odds with each other at the time. And the socialists and the opportunistic politicians and the monopoly corporations all worked to kill the original progressive movement. And now socialists call themselves progressives, but what they wanted is very different from what the original progressives wanted.
So what would you say would be the difference between what the two groups wanted?
Socialists were for big government, and progressives, at those early progressives, were for a free market. And the progressive movement, there were progressives prior to Henry George. The most notable group that called itself progressive was the Society of Progressive Friends, which was a Quaker abolitionist group in eastern Pennsylvania,
okay,
primarily in Lancaster and York. And because it grew out of the abolitionist movement, its approach to everything was locate the privilege that's underlying this problem and abolish the privilege. And then the free market will work because it will be free of privilege. The essential difference between them and even between them and today's libertarians, because it was a libertarian movement, but today's libertarians, instead of wanting to abolish privilege, they want to abolish all the restrictions on privilege. So land monopoly is a privilege. The private creation of money is a privilege. Today's libertarians want government to not restrict either of those. And the earlier libertarians and the earlier progressives recognized that the earth was not produced by labor, it was here for everybody. So they wanted to say, well, everybody has an equal right of access to the land, and the way to make that work is to collect the rental value of the land and distribute it on a per capita basis. And that way, if you don't have your share of the land, you have your share of rent. And if you're ready to take up land and do something with it, your share of rent will get you your share of land. That was the whole point of it. And then the idea of money is that the government should create the new money, and it should not go to big government programs. It should be in the form of tax cuts. So the government's budget would be constant, but the new money would fund what taxes had been scheduled to fund, so everybody could get a rebate on their taxes. At the time, federal taxes were very low, mostly on tariffs, and the progressives wanted to get rid of the tariffs if at all possible. So that was the controversy at the time. But the United Labor Party did well in the New York City race because it had tremendous support from Irish immigrants. Irish immigrants were laser focused on the land issue.
Really?
In fact, yeah, if because they had come from Ireland, where the Irish land was all English owned, or just about all English owned, and the only Irish who lived in Ireland who owned land had capitulated with England, joined the Church of England. Very few, in terms of Irish Catholics, they were all, just about all, renters of their own land. And they had just gone through the potato famine, during which they exported more food than they needed. In other words, if they weren't exporting food to pay rents to English landlords, they would have had enough food. There would have been no famine. So the Irish really strongly identified with the land monopoly issue.
Okay.
A surprising number of Jewish people supported the land value tax issue. Probably because in Europe particularly, they were denied access to land, and they were also very free market capitalists. I mean, part of why there's a lot of anti-Semitism is that is tied to anti-capitalism. And even Marx, who was Jewish, he denounced the Jewish culture as the capitalist culture, and Jewish people were able, through intelligent trading and negotiating and stuff, they were able to enrich themselves despite their having no access to land. In many European countries, they were not allowed to own land. So they were making the best of a bad situation. And then we had a lot of Quakers and Unitarians. And Unitarians because they tend to challenge orthodoxy generally, and Quakers because they had challenged land monopoly in England. And William Penn was given Pennsylvania, but there were more Quakers in New Jersey than in Pennsylvania. And,
oh, really?
Yeah, and Quakers invented the monopoly game, and it got stolen by Parker Brothers. That's a whole other story. But they invented the monopoly game to show about the evils of real estate monopoly.
Huh.
So, but that's, yeah, the four primary religious groups that backed the progressive movement were Catholics, especially Irish Catholics, Quakers, Unitarians, and Jews. And that's still, if you look at the Georgist movement today, there's a disproportionate number of those religious subgroups in it.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier the differences between libertarians and progressives in regards to the land tax. When you were in the Libertarian Party, as you said, chair, right?
Yeah, county chair.
County chair. How did your fellow libertarians receive your views, or was it something that didn't come up?
Some of them loved it and some of them hated it. And
okay.
So it was something that actually when I was chair, I promoted land value tax a lot more when I was not chair. And I thought that my role of chair has to be, to promote the party generally and the effectiveness of the party, and not to indulge in anything that's divisive. So I pushed it hard before I became chair, and I pushed it hard after I was no longer chair. But while I was chair, it was just like, well, we're not going to do anything about that issue. We're just going to take on other issues. And that seemed to work well.
It seemed to work well?
Yeah, that seemed to, yeah.
So you kept focused on your job responsibility when you were chair, And then after you were chair, then you went back to focusing on the land issue.
Yeah.
How does this work with issues such as the Native Americans being on the property? A lot of people say we stole land from the Native Americans, it's theirs, so we have no right to impose any type of land system. How would this deal with that issue?
Well, we did steal a lot of land, but they had been stealing land from each other. And so the Georgia's position is that nobody rightly owns land, that Mark Twain, who was something of a Georgist, he said it's just, there is no land in the possession of its rightful owner. It's all just taken in one conquest after another. And if you get down to the point of collecting rent and making cash payments, American Indians are largely relegated to the worst land. So in general, there are exceptions, but in general, the American Indians that sold their land became poor. The American Indians that refused to sell their land got wiped out. And but the American Indians who leased their land did very well. So like the Seneca Indians, the cities of Ithaca, New York and Seneca, New York are owned by the Seneca tribe. And they collect rent from that. And I don't know if a land value tax would diminish that, but overall, American Indians, if they got a per capita share of the rent, would be getting much more than they have now, because they are on the least valuable land. I mean, when you look at the rental value of land, it's very urban. It's people think of it taxing farmers, but a square yard of prime Manhattan real estate is worth more than an acre of average New York State farmland. So the land value is extremely urban.
Okay. So the Native Americans would benefit from this system.
Yeah. Yeah, and Russell Means endorsed it. He came to one of our conferences and spoke about it. Russell, for people who don't know, Russell Means was a leader of the American Indian movement. I think he was the head of it for a while. And he's also famous as the voice of Pocahontas' father in the Disney movie.
Oh.
But he had been in the protests that got the AIM leaders arrested and put in jail, and he was charged with a felony, and his felony charge was refusing to rise when the judge entered the courtroom, and that was a felony in I forget it, maybe South Dakota or somewhere. And because of that felony, he couldn't run for office in Arizona later on when he wanted to do so. He was going to run as a libertarian. And so that's one of those little anomalies that government takes itself very seriously. So things that have real consequences are often misdemeanors, but failure to rise for the judge when he enters the courtroom is a felony in that state, whichever one that was.
Yeah, that sounds ridiculous.
And those things have crept up, and the election system has crept up too. I mean, I've been looking at it. It used to be that there were fusion candidates who were nominated by more than one party. So, if you look at old ballots, there were Democrats who were nominated by the Democratic Party and the Socialist Party, and both parties listed their party affiliation under the candidate's name, and there were it wasn't the Libertarian Party, but there were what you would call right-wing parties, that there were Republicans who had their name as they were on the ballot as a Republican and as that other party. And they were only on the ballot once, but if you voted the straight party ticket of either party, they got that vote. And that's one of the things that slowly got eliminated. And Thomas Jefferson was against parties, period. He said, if I have to get to heaven by way of a political party, I shall not go. There was, the whole mentality of electing people has changed into one of a political struggle. It's a struggle of factions where it had been regarded as a duty. So the idea was that the citizens would examine the candidates and choose someone who was honorable and trustworthy, rather than I want to get what I want. And so, now the politician is almost viewed as a pawn in the pursuit of a larger agenda, that everybody fills out questionnaires and we say, well, we support Trump because he will protect the Second Amendment, and we support Biden because he will support gun control or abortion or whatever it is. And the candidate's integrity doesn't seem to matter nearly as much to large numbers of people as it did in the early days. And in the very early days, politics was just as vicious, but it was much more a matter of the candidate's personal integrity was much more important than it is today.
Sure. So you have a website about George's stuff, right?
Yeah, I have savingcommunities.org,
okay,
which is a pragmatic, it's more primarily about land value tax, but it takes on some other things. Okay. And then the Council of Georgist Organizations has a website listing the various organizations and a YouTube channel. So there's several webcasts on the YouTube channel. If you look up Council of Georgist Organizations, that's the name of the channel. And it basically interviews people like we're doing here on mostly land and money issues. Sometimes there's a variation. Somebody just talked about patents, and so we did an interview with a college professor who had interesting ideas on incentive systems that would get rid of patent monopolies, particularly, and possibly copyright monopolies. Henry George made a distinction between patents and copyrights.
So he was okay with copyrights?
Yeah, well, I don't know that he was completely okay with it, but he said there's a fundamental difference in that you copyright the actual work. So you can write a story, and I can write a very similar story, but as long as I'm not copying your story word for word, then my story can go through. But with a patent, you can't build something based on the same idea. It doesn't have to be the identical product. It's just like, well, this product uses this magnetic microphone to pick up the voice and send it over the telephone wires. Well, Alexander Graham Bell has the patent on that. So somebody else's device, even if it was substantially different, it still uses that concept. And so nobody else could sell a telephone in the United States when Bell had the monopoly. And apparently he beat his rival to the patent office by an hour, and the rival's telephone was better, but since he got the patent and the rival didn't, he got to make the phones, and he actually, because his rival didn't get the patent, he was able to incorporate his rival's technological improvements into his telephone. So it's, there's a lot of problems with the patent system, and with the focus on monopoly privilege as opposed to just capitalism or free trade or whatever, the focus on monopoly privilege was such that the early progressives wanted to undercut anything that created monopolies. So right-of-way monopolies would be publicly owned. That's the one thing progressives said. Government should own the railroad lines, because they already own the roads and most of the canals, but they should own the railroad lines, the streetcar lines, the water and sewer lines, the electric lines. There was Tom Johnson, who was mayor of New York, was a big Georgist supporter, and he made his fortune in streetcar monopolies, and then realized that was a privilege. He was profiting off a privilege, and he tried to give away his equity in some of the streetcar monopolies, and he forced down the fares in Cleveland when he was mayor of Cleveland, and he pushed to have Cleveland Municipal Light. He's the one that Cleveland Municipal Light was owned by the city of Cleveland, but he was not willing to municipalize natural gas because he thought it was too dangerous for government to play with. He was afraid that there would be the risk of gas line explosions and things if it was not done by private enterprise. So he allowed private companies to sell natural gas in Cleveland, but not to sell electricity.
So Dan, how can our audience support you? What's the best way for them to support you in your endeavors?
I have not set up a good system. I joined Locals, and so there is Saving Communities is on locals.com. I haven't really pushed that, but I'm going to be making videos that will appear on Locals first, and then have discussions, and anybody who's a subscriber to Locals can discuss the video that was made, and then we will upload we will append the discussions, the original video, and upload that to YouTube to get the broader audience. But that's what I have in mind, but I haven't done anything with it yet. And
so for the time being, going to your website at savingscommunities.org?
Yeah. And go to /docs, DOCS. There's wonderful documents from early progressives and libertarians, and some from more recent libertarians, and sometimes a critique of bad socialist ideas or bad neo-libertarian ideas. I don't use the word neoliberal because socialists have applied that word to everybody they don't like. Everybody I don't like is neoliberal. Well, it originally had a meaning, and the meaning is very close to neo-libertarian. It's just libertarians who changed under Hayek, Rothbard, Rand, and Mises, the libertarian movement kind of got captured by, I would say, reactionary anti-socialists. And that occurred as it was a reaction to FDR's big government programs. And it's an understandable reaction, but if you look at Albert J. Nock was the last, I would say the last big name in classical libertarian thinking. And he was much more nuanced about these issues.
Sure.
So.
Dan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it. In terms of minor parties, I would just like to see them be more strategic and, don't run somebody against, if you're a libertarian and there's a Republican on the ballot who's far more libertarian than most Republicans, don't run against him. In fact, have your guys go support him. And if you're a Green and there's it'll probably be a Democrat, if there's a Democrat who's very pro-Green, who's very similar in his outlook to what you like, don't run against him. Support that person. And I see the Libertarian Party, which I've been closer to lately, but I think the same thing is true with the Greens. The Libertarians will run against somebody who's very libertarian because it's an ego thing. I saw Libertarians denounce Ron Paul for running as a Republican. Well, he had been the Libertarian Party nominee and he got nowhere. And he ran as a Republican and won. And so, to their credit, the Texas Libertarians did not nominate anybody to run against him in Congress. He was the only congressional candidate in Texas who did not have a Libertarian Party contender. But when he ran for president, a whole bunch of Libertarians just denounced him for running as a Republican, and it was like, well, he can have far more impact as a Republican. So why not? And so I caution the minor parties against don't let your party become an end in itself. Your party has to be a mechanism to advance something you believe in.
So you believe in subordinating the party to the beliefs?
Yeah, if I would rather support a Republican who thinks like a libertarian than a libertarian who thinks like a Republican. And in the same way, the Greens, when I was with the Greens, they were far more decentralist. And if you look at the original 10 key values of the Greens, they were nothing like they are today. If I found a candidate who was close to those values, I would support that candidate regardless of party.
I see.
So, well, I guess that's about it, unless you had some final thoughts or...
Dan, we thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about your experience and your beliefs about the Georgia's land issue and Henry George and all that good stuff.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to hearing this. And because I don't have the podcast in front of me, what is the URL of your podcast?
The podcast is done through different podcasting platforms, so there's not one URL. It's done through Spotify, Anchor. It's done through Google Podcasts, Pocket Podcasts, Pocket Cast, and a lot of the other ones too. So it's Anchor is the hub of it, and it's distributed through Anchor to these other platforms. So,
Okay.
but I can surely send you the information when it goes live, as I plan to.
And I look forward to hearing it, and I'll check out your other podcasts as well.
Excellent. All right, Dan, we wish you all the best in your future and present endeavors with the land movement and everything else you do.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye now.
Bye.